Hello, everybody. Welcome to Constellations Conversations with Nicola Dunn and me, Robert Rowland Smith. Hello, Nicola.
Hi, Robert. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. We thought we'd take on the very simple topic today of truth, truth as related to constellations. And I imagine there are all sorts of ways of thinking about this, because a constellation, apart from anything else, has the truth with which a client arrives, which may or may not be factually accurate. They may be speaking their truth, as the phrase goes today, which has a value, but isn't necessarily the same thing as objective truth. We also have the truth as in terms of the accuracy of a representative and their representation, how trustworthy that, how true to what they're representing that truth is. I think we probably also have the truth of representatives in a constellation when they are acting from their own place. So they themselves can be speaking their truth, what's true for them, which can be a little bit at variance with what is right for the constellation as a whole, or right for the system. So we've got a whole can of worms, I think, that we're getting going with. And probably, I mean, there's only a few worms I mentioned there. There's probably some others that you're thinking about too.
Well, we all need worms, don't we? We all need worms. Are very important for our eco cycle. So I love that, actually, that distinguishing of the different types of truth. You know, the universal truth, there is this idea of some kind of universal truth. And then very much in contemporary life, we have an idea of my truth, my personal experience, which often has, an emotional element to it. I felt my truth was I felt offended by this and hurt and disregarded. All these things are very important. So they're the personal perspective. And then there is the truth, I guess, which we're also concerned about, which aligns around facts. What happened, what didn't happen. Yeah. And I think, a client or seeker arrives with a personal truth, which is very important to them. And we are looking for a systemic truth that is going to be resourcing for them as they move forward in their life.
Yeah. I think I remember you and I trained together, Nicola, and one of the things I remember being taught is, particularly in the opening conversation with the client, to make a separation between their truth, or what we might call, a bit less kindly, I suppose, their story on the one hand, and the facts on the other, as though this was a tenet, really, of the constellator's approach, that you've arrived with your truth, your story, but if it was so brilliant or so good, how come you're suffering, I suppose. And therefore the more or less direct intervention of the constellator then is to create a bit of a weaning process where people are weaned off of that narrative truth they arrive with. Firstly, by, as you say, revisiting or reminding themselves of the facts, because, just to go a bit further with that thought, often the facts don't quite correspond with the story that's being told, or there are more facts which don't quite fit into the story, because a story is, stories, in my experience, people speaking their truth or giving their story, tends to be quite coherent. My mother's a narcissist and that's why I'm fucked up, or something like that. They arrive with a story, a truth, which is also a theory, and quite tied up, I suppose. Whereas when we then introduce some facts, is it not also the case that your mother looked after you when you were in hospital for those 2 years? We now have a fact that doesn't fit that story, and yet is just as valid as anything else. So we have kind of two systems on the go, if you like. And I take from that the constellator, in a way, needs to hear the story and hear the suffering that it produces, but must also then begin to include facts. So stories thrive on the exclusion of facts, I would put it, to put another way.
Yes, and there's that common saying, isn't there? Don't let facts get in the way of a good story. And so the story itself is a craft, and some people are very good at crafting stories and narratives. And then, of course, if they use that for good, that's wonderful. If they use it for not so good, it's manipulative, because they're excluding elements in order to persuade. So families have narratives generally which support the view of the family, the way they want to present to the world. So this is how we get exclusions, isn't it? So that any family member or event that is unedifying tends to be pruned, and a more victorious or more sort of victim-orientated story around the family is orientated. But most of us, I think, our family histories that have given to us have positioned our family as struggling against particularly difficult circumstances, but not including the elements which might be a little bit more shadowy.
It makes me think how stories, as you say there, the kind of narratives in the family are themselves artifacts of belonging. In other words, there's a story about Uncle Billy and what a cad he was, and swashbuckling on the high seas, and we all think he's a great character. If I then buy into that story about Uncle Billy and rehearse it or pass it on, among other things, what I'm doing is saying, yes, I'm part of this family and I belong to this family by sharing in that story and sharing that story in turn. So they become ways of participation, I suppose, means of participation in the group. And at that point, the truth or otherwise of the story becomes secondary. What matters is that I buy into it in some way.
Yes. And, we often talk, don't we, in Constellations about the fact that we're looking for a expansion of truth that is going to be more useful for the client. Because they've normally come in with a narrative around the truthfulness of their family that is either painful or somehow feels incomplete or not resourcing. So we're looking for a degree of truth, and at the same time we have to acknowledge it's not a forensic truth that becomes available in the constellation. It's more kind of thematic in a way.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot recently about the fact we're all a bit lopsided when it comes to family stories. You speak to anybody and they're preoccupied a bit more with one side of the family than the other. That the father side, there's more characters, we visit them more often, there's more contact. The mother side, it's quieter. There are fewer stories, maybe fewer people, but it's a bit like being right-handed or left-handed. Everybody's a bit, mother-handed or father-handed. And I was doing an event a few days ago, and I asked people their experience of this. I said, if you think about your own family, who here would say they have a lopsided family in that sense? Every single hand went up. There were about 50 people in the room. And the reason I'm saying it is that one of the fundamental truths I think we can put in Constellation is both sides of the family, because stories begin, I think, on a bias. They before the story's even begun, they're already a bit lopsided because they are corroborating that idea that there's more family in one side of the family than there is in the other side of the family. And one of my kind of go-to moves recently has been just to set up a balance rather than follow down one line always.
Yes, and I would agree with you that I tend to always set up a balance. It's what I call family subsidence, in a sense, that one side feels that it's cracked and crumbling, and also for the issue holder or seeker, somehow less interesting, less talented, less whatever. But as we know, it's it's a limitation of resource. The sort of aperture is made smaller at that point as soon as one side is more dominant than the other.
Yeah. I ran a constellation a couple of years ago with a woman whose it was the mother's side were actually aristocratic, but she had married a man of a much lower class, and everything was continued to be about the aristocratic side of it. And exactly as you say, I love the phrase, the aperture of resource was much smaller as a result. And in fact, it was hard for the clients in that case, even to, at the beginning, even to accept the idea that they could be resource from the father's side, because they were lower class. What could they possibly do or help with here? As a systemic snobbery, effectively.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's highly likely it's the other side of the family where all the treasure was.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And the kind of benign goodwill that would be available to the client. So I think that is differences in the coming together of couples, and we're going to do something I know later another time, couples and love, is absolutely fascinating. But you're describing this, to what degree is the floor of the family house balanced?
Yes.
And and how is that weighted, and what then is the impact on the issue holder and seeker in order for their own life to flow?
Yeah. And then once you have that, I'm not recommending this as a formula. If there are kind of constellators watching this, or trainee constellators watching this, I'm not saying every time you must always set up both sides of the family, because I think that there are also problems with that too, and it can slow things down and all the rest of it. But I think it's an important principle there, that the truth falls under a larger intent, I suppose, in constellations, which is for it to be inclusive rather than exclusive. We do want to bring in facts, even or in particularly uncomfortable facts.
Yes, and that the issue holder or seeker's fascination with one side of the family, which might be a bit more glamorous somehow, is not always helpful for the challenges that they're facing. So when we spoke about the sort of beginning and the conversations with the client, that's a part of it, isn't it? It's a sense that where we have our little spirit level out, and we're kind of looking for where is the balance here? What's the aspect of this family, the family members, the events that need to be included in order for something to come into balance.
Yeah, exactly. What do you make of this phenomenon, which I think is rare, maybe is for you too, where you've got a constellation set up and you're underway, and the issue holder looks at it and says, but it's not like that. Now, in my experience, that's a very rare thing to happen. And in fact, in 90% or more than 90% of cases, the issue holder is looking on and either saying or feeling, my God, that is so accurate. That's so true. He's just like that, or it's uncanny. I mean, that's a very common remark that I hear. They don't always say it, but it's almost happens every time. But occasionally you will get somebody, an issue holder, who says, no, it's not like that. In other words, they see the mismatch between their truth and the truth in the constellation as represented through the representatives. I'd be interested to hear what your experience of that, because I've got only a few experiences, but tell me, you've come across that too, presumably?
I would say normally I have the experience that you have, which is people, surprised and maybe a little astounded that actually something that was quite private to them is being represented, and they actually find it very sort of reassuring that actually, okay, this is a real thing. I'm not making it up. This is difficult. This is challenging. On the rare occasion when it happens, I think it's often where there is perhaps there's been a very difficult relationship with a family member, So they might say something like, she's not like that, or she wasn't like that. She's always, I think it's that idea of how you protect yourself from difficulties sometimes in a family, which is that you defend yourself, and you decide that you won't be open in a fuller context, perhaps, to a particular family member. So the sense is often that I think this is the differentiation, that it should replicate their own remembered experience, what is available to them, as opposed to, which is what constellations do, is they go to illuminate the crack in the vase that will lead to the gold. So they're very efficient. So even, for example, if someone says to me, my parents were madly in love for, 70 years. Okay. It's a bold statement, isn't it? It's a very bold statement. And then you set the couple up, and perhaps they're facing in opposite directions. And so someone might legitimately say it wasn't like that. They were always arm's length, they were da-da-da. But actually what it's showing are the systemic forces upon their parents, which the parents may have been able to resist in some kind of way, but are actually now playing out through the issue holder or seeker. So I think it's an interesting point. If someone says that, I think probably you and I would then, inquire to what degree it doesn't match their inner picture, and at the same time still continue.
I've noticed a few times a specific example around male friendship, which is related to this, where, and actually just in general, in parenthesis, I'll say this, friendship as a theme comes up not nearly as often as one might expect in constellations. And I don't know if that's people arrive by thinking, oh, it has to be a family issue or rather than a friendship issue, but maybe it's something we can turn to in another conversation, this notion of friendship. The reason I mentioned male friendship is that I have noticed now enough times for it to be sort of statistically significant, I suppose. If I were a scientist, I might say this, that male friendships often have a veneer or a superficial structure of friendliness, but actually when you set up the friendship, it's not really as bonded as it's being portrayed as. I'm thinking of a specific example, actually, of a father and his son-in-law as related by the issue holder, who was the wife. So there's a wife, her husband, and her father. She had described this relationship as between the two of them as incredibly chummy. They were always out on the road, they had a lorry together or something and fishing. But actually in the constellation, that there was very little truth to that. It was, these people were sort of completely missing one another. And it was as if the more activities, they were doing more and more activities together in order to try and fill the gap of complete mutual misunderstanding. And it was in the constellation, it was almost a burden to both of them to have to keep up this performance, which they were kind of doing for the sake of the wife. And it's not, I pointed out because it's come up quite a few times, this idea of male friendship being not quite true to the reality.
So I'm immensely curious about that, as to whether the daughter-in-law brings into the family through marriage someone of a replica of systemic significance for the father and his history. So on the one hand, there is something about that the family that is now bonded in through marriage. At the same time, that in a sense, once that systemic element might be dealt with, whether that the sort of kind of jovial bonding that you're sort of talking about might settle down into something that felt truer and more robust. But it's fascinating. And also you probably have more experience of, I work quite a lot with men, but I haven't worked so much with male friendship in constellation, perhaps through, in war situations, yes, when it's a different kind of bonding. but I'll look out for that, and also when I constellate female friendship as well.
Yeah, perhaps again, another topic for us. We could talk about why more women go to constellations workshops than men. That might be an interesting topic for us. Because I was also thinking, actually, I do quite a lot of probably about half and half corporate constellations or organizational constellations. And of course, it depends on the industry enormously, but I would generally get more men, around in those environments. And of course, the question of truth in an organizational environment has a different quality to it, because there is often quite a lot of effort spent, literally, by organizations in presenting a certain kind of truth about themselves. So we know, for example, about greenwashing would be a classic example these days. And so, and also putting in the consequences of their actions in for a community. So a business that's active in the community, or even if it's just, I remember done constellations for supermarkets, for example, and the effect of that business on the wider system, suppliers, farmers, consumers, and so on. Maybe the point there is, again, simply that truth is an inclusive, not an exclusive concept, and that actually in organizations, they tend to be a bit more nervous about that. I mean, families can be nervous about it too, but because there's so much money invested in organizations in circulating a certain truth and projecting that truth, it feels the stakes are somehow, if not higher, they're differently geared.
Yes, and at the same time, people are probably inherently suspicious of organizations that can't hold a wider truth, the way they would be with politicians.
Exactly. Yes, that's very, very well put. Yes.
In the way that even an individual that you might meet who is, robustly defensive about how marvelous their own family is. I'm smiling here just because, and most of us come from families that are more multi-dimensional, let's put it like that. So I think you're raising the issue of truth and artifice.
Yeah. Yes, truth and artifice, and truth and provenance as well. I think one of the most fascinating constellations I've ever been involved in, I think I can probably reveal this because it didn't involve any personal data, and it was done in a kind of study environment, was in relation to the largest flower business in Europe, which is based in the Netherlands. And I think it's near Rotterdam, a place called Flora Holland. And it processes the vast majority of all the flowers that come to Europe. And I think it's the second biggest in the world. Anyway, we constellated the supply chain of these flowers, back to where they were grown. In some cases, certainly roses grown in Kenya on the supply. Maybe you know about it, but it was fascinating to look at. And I think supply chains are particularly important in relation to constellations, because you're literally giving a place to everybody who has contributed to the product. And it's a very, very nice way. Anybody who's interested in organizational constellations, I would always recommend, if it's appropriate, looking at supply chain, because it's absolutely systemic, as the system brought to life.
Whenever I've worked with organizations and done that, I agree, because once you sort of go back into the historical supply chain, often there are things that have, let's just say, been unattended to.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating process. So no one produces anything alone. Exactly
right. Same in families in a way. It's and to isolate threads within it, I think, is a lot of the origin of our problems. It reminds me also of Karl Marx talks about the idea that when we suppress the provenance of a product. Of course, he's got a political view, because in doing that, we are suppressing the input of labor that's gone into it. What we're also doing is creating a magic effect for the product itself. He calls it commodity fetishism, because it's like a fetish in the old sense, like a magical object. So when in the West we go on Amazon accounts and buy stuff, it arrives almost kind of magically, and we don't think about the provenance of it really. It has a kind of magic aura to it, precisely through having its provenance and supply chain sort of erased, essentially. And I think a similar thing happens in constellations. We create these magical artifacts that are, stories, people, precisely because we haven't included the co-producers of that individual, the co-producers of that artifact or symptom.
And normally the health of the organization or the family, the final product, is very much impacted by those that contributed that have been forgotten or treated badly.
Yeah, that's right. So in that sense, truth, I hadn't imagined arriving at this point, and we'll probably have to wrap up in a second, but the truth in that sense, to use a Bert Hellinger word, is as much about acknowledgement as it is about truth. It's not truth in the metaphysical sense of, eternal verities. These are acknowledging what's gone into a situation, those who've contributed to it, those who've contributed and then been forgotten, those who've been excluded. So, yeah, I think that is the particular shading of the notion of truth in constellations. It's the acknowledging, I think.
Yes, truth is about inclusion and acknowledgement, and about those that have paid a price in order that others have gained. And I think that's, maybe Karl Marx would quite like that.
Yeah.
So it's been a fascinating actually conversation with you, Robert, actually just going through those different elements of truth. So we need to finish now, but thank you to all our listeners and viewers, and please like and subscribe. That helps us to keep going. And you can contact Robert through his website, robertrowlandsmith.com. And I'm available through mine, Nicola Dunn, Constellations.com.